Properties of real numbers. Today we're going to discuss all of the properties that will help us solve expressions. Let's start with the guiding question, which is what properties can we use to simplify equations so that they are easier to solve? By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify the properties of real numbers so that you can begin to simplify equations or expressions. Here's a quick warm-up. All right, some of these seem pretty easy, but these will help kind of understand why we're using these properties. And these are just using whole numbers, but you'll see how this applies to all real numbers. So 3 plus 1 is 4, 1 plus 3 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8, 2 times 4 is 8. 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6. 2 plus 1 plus 3 is 6. Notice just because I'm switching certain orders, it doesn't make the answer any different when we're adding and multiplying. 1 times 2 times 3 is 6. 3 times 1 times 2 is 6. All right, remember, anytime we add 0, we just get the number itself. And anytime we multiply 1, the same thing. We get the number itself. And anytime we multiply by -1, we get that number itself with a negative in front of it. All right, pretty easy stuff. So the properties now. Commutative property of addition, not commutative. There's no N in there. Commutative, like you are commuting. So an easy way to remember this is if we have variables, A plus B equals B plus A. So if you're commuting somewhere, you're going from point A to point B, and then back from point A to point, or back from point B to point A. Either way, you're traveling the same distance. So whether you go from home to school and then from school to home, it should be the same distance traveled. So the commutative property allows us to switch the order when we are adding. It also works when we are multiplying, as you can see here. So we have the commutative property of addition and multiplication. The associative property of addition and multiplication deals with grouping. All right, so associative, all right, means group. So here, if we have A plus B in parentheses plus C, that's the same as saying A plus B plus C. All right, just because the order of operation here, even though you add parentheses, doesn't matter because you're using the same operation. So addition and multiplication have these properties called the associative property that allows us to change the grouping. We also have the identity properties. So the identity property of addition just tells us anything we add by 0, we get that same answer. So here A plus 0 equals A. Multiplication identity says anything we multiply by 1 is itself. So A times 1 is just A. We also have the 0 property of multiplication, which tells us anything we multiply by 0, we get 0. And the multiplication property of -1, which states that anything we multiply by -1 becomes the opposite of itself. So notice I said opposite and not negative. Anytime we have a variable, we are not going to use negative for this sign. We are going to use opposite. Because if we say negative, we might sometimes think that this variable is negative. That might not be true. All right, because if the variable is negative, so if A were to equal -3, this whole thing would actually be positive because you'd have the opposite of -3. All right, so you would have -3, which is really the same as just 3. So you don't want to use the word negative if a minus sign is in front of a variable. You want to use the word opposite. So how does this apply? Well, it can apply directly when we need to solve something quickly. You will learn how it applies in the sense of algebra a little later, but for now we're just going to stick to other real numbers that have a value. So for example, this first one we have 7.75 plus 2.40, okay, plus $1.25. So if you want to think about things that you're buying, if you're buying 3 things, but the first 2 things you buy are $7.75 and $2.40, and then you decide to buy another thing that's $1.25, in your head it might be easier to switch them. So first I want to switch the order of these in parentheses. Remember, switching the order is commutative. Now switching the grouping, because it's easier to add these things in my head than it would be 2.40 and 7.75, I want to switch the grouping, which is the associative property. So now I can do this a little more easily in my head, which is 11.4. And I know you're all thinking, well, can't I just punch that in my calculator? Why do I have to switch all this stuff around? Well, when we start dealing with variables, you're not going to be able to punch letters into your calculator because your calculator is not going to understand them. So we need to understand these properties to make equations look easier when we're dealing with variables. All right, so here's some examples with variables. Now remember, anytime we see no spacing, so if we have 5 times parentheses or something, multiplication is implied here. Okay, so this means 5 times what's in those parentheses. Okay, or anytime we have a number and then a variable, multiplication is implied. All right, so 5 times 3n, which is what this first part says, I rewrote it to show you that multiplication is implied in those areas. But now I can use the associative property, which remember is grouping, to switch the grouping so I can write a more simplified version of that. 15n looks way better than 5 times 3n. So that's how we can use it with variables. That's why it's important to know these properties. All right, so now we've learned about the properties of multiplication and addition to help us make expressions easier to look at. We're now going to apply these problems to algebraic equations, which will allow us to more easily solve for variables in the future. All right, so there's a couple examples after this lesson that I'd like you to complete, and then you can go to the check your understanding and finish that.